Hello and welcome to the January and February 2025 update for Blue Sky Aces, a low-poly World War I flight simulator currently under development. The last couple of months have been really busy, but I finally managed to update the demo build on Steam, which importantly includes the new simulation flight model. This has been the source of many sleepless nights during the last quarter of 2024, so it was really great to finally get it released. There's a lot to cover off this time, so I'll get straight into it. The first change that I really like is the addition of the new mission date field, which controls which aircraft you'll face during the mission. This is a really simple option, but it helps a lot with the mission replay value. This change came about because of the performance differences between the aircraft, which became much more noticeable with the simulation flight model. Having Irondeckers versus Camels and DH2s versus DR1s was no longer ideal, especially if you were flying the early war aircraft. Now you're going to be facing off against similar aircraft. However, if you want to give yourself a challenge or an advantage, then you can simply shift the mission date forward or back to make it mission easier or harder. Next up was the addition of two new aircraft, with the first being the Fokker DVI. This late war German fighter is best described as a stopgap, which is almost certainly developed to make use of available rotary engines. The fuselage is a really close match to the DR1, but with scaled down wings from a D7. Feedback from pilots of the era was generally good, although it was underpowered. The next aircraft, which is still under construction, is the Royal Aircraft Factory Se5a. If the Camel was a sports car, then the Se5s were the Toyota Corolla of the British fighters. Not as flashy as the better known Camel, but solid and reliable, and without any of the dangerous handling quirks that made the Camel so difficult to fly. As part of adding these two new aircraft, we've started making some small improvements to the cockpit details and animations. Initially this has involved animating parts of the models that we've already got, but over time this will include adding more details to the cockpits. I imagine that this is something that's going to be an ongoing process. The next piece of work involved two improvements to the bullet damage effects that I briefly touched on in the last video. The first was the tendency for bullet holes to bleed onto the ground after a crash. This was caused by the fact that the holes are projected onto the aircraft model using a cool shader effect. However, this can also project the holes onto nearby geometry such as the ground. The solution is to use something called the stencil buffer, which provides a mask for the screen. The aircraft models are rendered with a specific mask value, and the bullet holes only render onto pixels that have this aircraft mask value. The other item was a performance improvement to speed up the rendering of the bullet holes. Generally speaking, games want to reduce the number of draw calls that they make to the GPU, as the high draw calls don't tend to scale well. Previously each bullet hole was a separate draw call, but with some small changes to the shader and some code that manages the bullet holes, I've now rendering all the bullet holes with a single draw call. Following the first demo update in January, it became obvious that the aircraft AI had developed some issues. They had a tendency to lose altitude in a dogfight, which resulted in them fighting just above their minimum altitude, where ground collisions were much more likely. They were also doing things that were making them vulnerable to stall, which was a real problem with them flying at such low altitude when there was very little time to recover. To help diagnose and test these issues, I created a demo scene where the AI aircraft battle it out with each other in an endless dogfight, with new aircraft being introduced as required. The camera changes which aircraft it's following every 30 seconds, giving me an idea of how the AI is performing in a very busy environment. When I've seen enough, I can check the logs to see how each aircraft was destroyed, which helps build a picture of how good the AI performed. One of the solutions identified was to change how they turn to follow their target. The new logic uses the same code that the player mouse controls use to fly to the mouse target. In addition, the AI now performs checks during a dogfight to take action to avoid a stall, rather than simply waiting until it happens before responding. Another issue that multiple people had noticed was that the AI aircraft would often follow you without firing, even though they seemed to be in an ideal firing position. There turned out to be a really easy explanation for this one. The AI aircraft were simply firing continuous bursts for too long, causing their guns to jam, leaving them helpless for 20 to 30 seconds. With this fix, they're now way more deadly, especially with other improvements to their ability to lead the target. Another big piece of work I've started on is a series of tools to help build larger maps based on real locations. The first task is to generate terrain based on satellite data, with the catch being that the terrain style needs to match the existing style used in the game, instead of a low-res satellite image that looks all pixelated up close. My approach was to use a Blender plugin which combines Google Maps with various GIS data sources to generate a textured height map for a given location. Next, I decimate the mesh slightly to reduce the polygon count and to break up the regular checkerboard pattern. Finally, I import the mesh into Unity and run a tool that I created, which samples the colour at the middle of each triangle to generate a palette texture. The tool also regenerates the mesh to update the texture coordinates and recalculate the normals to finish off the low poly look. Trees were next, although this is still a work in progress. The first part of this work was to add tree lines and hedges along the edges of the terrain triangles to help define the fields. There's a bit of randomness involved to ensure that not every edge gets trees. The current method doesn't generate forests, but I suspect it might be easier to just place these by hand with my existing tree painting tools. The next major task is buildings, and the same Blender GIS plugin also has the ability to generate buildings based on OpenStreetMap's data it pulls in. At first glance this looks pretty good, but when you look closer the buildings have no roofs and the heights of the buildings are all the same. Initially I had the idea of creating a script to alter the generated buildings to improve their look. Unfortunately this was a dead end as the building shapes were just too irregular and too difficult to modify. The next idea was to substitute the generated buildings with models that I'd already used within the game. However, this too proved to be a lost cause. The problem here was the same as before. The building shapes were just too irregular, which made it difficult to work out where to put the models to create the necessary density. The roads and lanes also disappeared with this method, which really destroyed the overall look. I've since taken a break from this to focus on other tasks, and to give me time to think of other solutions. My plan is to have another go early next month, and my current thinking is to use the generated buildings as a guide to where to place the models. The thing that's still to work out is how to efficiently place the large number of buildings required. Beyond the buildings, generating roads, lakes and rivers are the next on the task list. Again, there's GIS data available to generate these, but the question will be as to whether this proves any easier to use for generating the map, or whether it's best to use as a template only. As usual, if you like to keep up with my progress, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on my next update. And give me a thumbs up if you found that interesting. If you'd like to give the game a try, then check out the link in the description to the game's Steam page where you can play the demo for free. And don't forget to wishlist it so you'll be notified when the game is released. If you got this far, then thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next time.